Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Help for HDTV. Today, we have Marie Clay on with us. We were having a little bit of internet trouble, but we were able to get her to come in via phone. Today, going to talk about feeding tubes, and not necessarily about a feeding tube process, but actually an incident that happened with Marie Clay's daughter, Lori. Welcome to the show, Marie.
Oh, thank you for having me, and thank you for your patience.
Yeah, no problem. And Marie has been a part of the Huntington's disease community for a very long time. So Marie, could you give us just a little bit of background on yourself?
Sure. My husband was diagnosed in 1993, a couple years after he retired from the Navy. Lori inherited the gene, and she was diagnosed in 2000. So she's been dealing with this now 23 years.
And she is a fighter. I love watching the pictures of her smile, and what an amazing daughter she is.
Yes, she's 51 years old, and she's always got a smile. She's got a positive attitude. And let me tell you, the past 2 weeks, not seeing that smile just devastated us because we knew she was not herself.
And before we go into like the story of what has happened most recently in those 2 weeks that you just mentioned, who is Lori's like care team or support?
Lori's fiance, Michael, they'll be together 26 years in February.
Yay!
He's been by her side a long time. Last year we had a silver anniversary for them. I had a big to do, just Lori, Michael, their son Michael, and myself, but we went all out on their 25th anniversary. So Michael is her primary caregiver, even though he cares for her 24/7. Last year he retired, and so he's her primary caregiver. So he's compensated somewhat a few hours a day through Medicaid. And just recently, I became the respite caregiver, even though I'm there and he has to go to the store, he has appointments, or he just needs to just get away a little bit. So then I just jump in, even though I'm there anyway. So he said they'd rather have me than to pay a stranger because I know her so well.
Sure.
So it's Michael and I and their son. He's going to be 25, but let me tell you, he's for a 25-year-old kid, he's amazing with his mother. And he can do caregiving just as good as any medical person.
I can see that in your posts. He's very involved.
I think our children have to grow up so much faster. They become caregivers very young. It's a different role, and it's a almost deeper love that they learn.
Yeah, he can transfer her. He sits and he will, because she has the contractions in her arms, he will sit and stretch her arms for her. And every time he's sitting, he'll pull up a chair next to her on the sofa, and he's got his arms around her. And the minute he walks in the door, Lori's got this big smile on her face.
Why don't we go into a little bit about what happened recently with Lori?
Sure. Lori's had the feeding tube about a little more than a year and a half. It'll be 2 years in August. And she's been doing really well because when she first got it, she was down to 89 pounds. Now she's up to 106. She's comfortable with the feeding tube situation, no problems there. It was Thursday, December 22nd. It was in the evening. Michael was giving her one of her late feedings. And because of the chorea, her left arm movement jerked and it pulled out the feeding tube. It had to have been a hard jerk for that tube to come out.
Sure.
So she didn't need any more feeds until the next day. So early next morning, he called the doctor. The doctor made arrangements, and Norfolk General, which is a huge hospital here, said to bring her in at 1. And they said it was really just minor surgery, but they could get her in between their other surgeries. We got there at 1, and we were leaving there at 6 p.m. So I thought, really, that was great time. So we left. She pulled out her J tube, and they never said anything to make us think anything else was done. So we thought, okay, we'll just go home. We'll continue doing the gravity feed with her. We noticed that there was, in the paperwork, there was a page with a QR code, but nothing, just curious. I'm trying to do the QR code, and Michael tried to do the QR code because I know with me, I have problem with electronics. Michael tried it and nothing would come up. So they were supposed to tell us that it was a G tube not a J tube, and that we had to check for residuals. Nobody told us that. So we went home and we continued to feed her like we normally did. The J tube goes into the small intestine, the G tube goes into the stomach, and the J tube has less of a chance of aspiration. On December 30th, just before New Year's, I went to Lori's house about 6 o'clock, and Michael wasn't feeling too good. When I got there, Lori looked a little tired. Lori's sleep schedule is not typical. Lori doesn't go to bed till 3 in the morning, at least. And then she sleeps until 2, 3 in the afternoon. So we go with her schedule, not ours.
Right.
Yeah. So she looked a little tired to me. I tried to call Michael to tell him, Lori doesn't look too good. And he must have had his phone off because he was at patient first. And he called me right away. And I told him, I said, she looked lethargic. She just was incoherent. I says, I'm calling 911. He said he was waiting for COVID results because, of course, he didn't feel good. They were going to do a COVID test on him.
Sure.
Okay, so call 911. When they arrived, they did an evaluation on her. I told them about HD, had to give them a quick education on HD, had to tell them to be careful picking her up because of the chorea, her stiffness in her arms, don't force her. And they were very gentle, very good with her. I had to reassure Lori that she'd be okay because I couldn't ride in the ambulance. Yeah, and even though she was nonverbal, I said, you're in good hands. And then I told her, we'll meet you at the ER. I'll follow you at the ER. And then I got to the waiting room, and I had to wait in the waiting room until they could verify that she was being admitted by the ambulance entrance. I'm just worried because this poor girl's nonverbal. She's not feeling good.
Sure.
So once she was in the ER exam room, they examined her. They set her an IV. They drew blood. They had to use a catheter for urine sample. And her veins are so tiny. It was so painful that they had to keep sticking her with the needles. Yeah. And of course, I was advising the nurses about the Huntington's and how to be careful of the movement of her head, her legs, her arms, things like that. So in the meantime, while they're doing all that and they're running the test, Michael calls me and tells me he's got COVID.
Oh, gosh.
I'm like, oh, Lordy. So you tell the nurse. So I told the nurse, and the nurse told me, she says, tell him as long as he wears a mask, he could come in. Because they don't ask in the front anyway. Just tell him that she's back here. So that's what he did.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So
That's great. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm surprised.
Yeah.
I'm surprised they wouldn't let you in the ambulance, but they'd let him come in.
I know.
Great, though. I'm sure it helped out.
Yeah.
So we're really good, and it wasn't the time to argue with anybody. Just get her to the hospital.
Sure. Yeah.
So finally, the tests start coming back in, and they advised us she had a UTI, she had sepsis, and she's got COVID.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Our guess, we think, because she has to have a catheter, not all the time, just when they need to get a urine sample, but we're guessing that it was a week before. We think she got the UTI and the sepsis at Norfolk General. And then she had picked up the COVID, so she had the perfect storm going on. That all happened on a Friday. Tuesday, they decided they were going to replace that tube. They replaced the tube, and they released her the next day. At 5 p.m., they released her. Just before they released her, she had a real bad case of diarrhea, and they still released her. They didn't say, let's talk to the doctor. They still released her, and they shouldn't have. And just before that, they had given her the formula maybe about an hour and a half before, and that formula ran right through her. So we get home, and it was time to give her formula again. No sooner got in her body, she had diarrhea again.
Oh, no.
The next day, Michael was going to put her from her wheelchair into the recliner. And I looked at her, and I saw that same look again. I said, Michael, she looks lethargic again, looked like her eyes were going back, and she felt very clammy. And I said, look, we got to call 911 again. So we did. And then all of a sudden, she started sweating so profusely, sweat just pouring off from her. Initially, they didn't want to admit Lori. but we pushed. We like, no, no, we're not. So they says, let's keep her overnight for observation in the ER.
Uh-huh.
Well, okay, we were okay with that. So they tried to do a drip feed on her in the middle of the night. And at 5 a.m., she started vomiting. Then she was vomiting Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Her infections were gone. A UTI was gone. The sepsis was gone. And so Michael says, why do you still have her on antibiotics then? And it was one of those, it was like they kind of looked like, yeah, why do we still have her on antibiotics? Because then they told us if you're on antibiotics too long, it's going to kill the good bacteria. So that's probably what was making her sick. So now she's got, it's a combination J tube and G tube, but we can't do the gravity feed because the J tube and the G tube share the same line. It won't go through unless you do the bolus where you force it. She's doing okay with the drip, but she's got to be on there at least 10 hours, 10 to 12 hours.
Oh, wow.
Where before with the gravity feed, we were done within 10 minutes. So she has to see the gastroenterologist February 15th. We're going to talk to him about going back to a gravity feed somehow and see what he says.
Like just putting her back. I don't know how easy that is. I'm sounding like it's just a flip of a
Yeah.
switch, but it'd be great if she could go back to what worked.
Right. Some people said just get her up early in the morning. I'm like, that's easy for us to do, to just get up earlier, but you can't, it's too difficult for Lori to change her pattern, her schedule. See, initially, Lori did not want a feeding tube, but last year when she was down to 89 pounds, her neurologist, who's an amazing woman, she had such a sincere talk with Lori. She explained everything in such detail. And what people forget is people with HD, they understand what's going on. They understand the conversations. They just can't verbalize what they're thinking or their answers or things like that. But she wasn't trying to persuade Lori one way or the other. She just explained Lori the benefits and the cons. And we went home, we all talked about it. And a couple of days later, we brought it up again. And Lori decided she wanted the feeding tube.
And it's 100% Lori's decision. Good for you guys. That's right. That was Mike did not want a feeding tube. And we went and he was losing an immense amount of weight. He was down to 80 pounds, 6'1". And his doctor, one of his care providers, did talk about a feeding tube with him. They talked about the comfort. They talked about this. He said no. And you're right. He was 100% there. He was verbal. He got it. We understood yes and no. It just took him time.
Yeah.
But that was his right to his body.
She's finally, the last day or so, she's coming back to herself where she's smiling, she's laughing, and so she's recuperating. Michael's just right now, his goal right now is looking after Lori. But I'm going to make it a point to reach out to both hospitals and tell them I'm very dissatisfied. You didn't listen to what we had to say and didn't give us the proper instructions. I still don't know what's on that QR code. Nobody can pick it up.
That's awesome.
There should definitely have been a little in-service training of some sort to show you the differences between what you were doing. Yeah.
And before we get off here, we were talking about this whole situation. We are messaging, and you said something that I thought this is brilliant. I really wanted to share because we share what we learn and on our own. And so you said something about what you do with the feeding tube pole.
Oh, yeah. Lori, she got used to us doing her feed, the gravity feed and everything. And when we did it, we always made sure it was a conversation time. It was usually me, her, and Michael. And it was conversation time to distract her, to make her relaxed. Now we come home with this feeding tube or this pole for her feeding bag. And Michael, he was just trying to learn, set it up. And I'm sitting there and we're talking and could see Lori and she's looking at this pole. So I messaged Michael on his phone. I didn't want to say it out loud. I said, Michael, can you put the pole behind her so she don't see it? I said, because I think it makes you sad. So he did. And so that's what we do now. We put the pole behind her and so she don't see it. And then when she's sitting in a recliner, we put it behind her. And I really think it made a difference because I kept catching her staring at it. And I'm thinking, what is she thinking? And that was something else I asked her neurologist last month. I says, it was a question that's really bothered me. I said, you know how when we're sitting and we're thinking to ourselves, thinking about what we got to do today, and if you're worried about, so you just think to yourself. I said, can people with HD do that? I know if they're nonverbal, but can they think for themselves or think to themselves? And she said, she said, some people can, some people can't. She says, but in Lori's case, I believe Lori can think to herself, have a conversation with herself. So with that alone, I'm like, she was probably staring at that pole, getting depressed, I'm sure. But I think since we've moved the pole out of sight, I think it takes away that image for her.
I like that thoughtfulness. I think it's a big show of just how things operate for Lori and the people around her supporting her. I think that's awesome.
Thank you, Marie, so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. And anybody ever wants to reach out to me, I'm always available.
Yes, absolutely. And Marie has helped hundreds of people throughout the years of her being an advocate for HD. And you can always find her on Facebook. She is on there in many groups. But thank you for coming on and sharing this story. And I think that'll do it for today. Everyone, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel below and ring the bell for notifications when more videos come out. Till next time.